Can I start with the reaction at the vigil in Manchester today? Was it right and appropriate to boo and heckle the Deputy Prime Minister?
I think the question really is what has caused that, and has the behaviour of the government been right and appropriate? I think that the crowd there obviously had very strong feelings about the appearance of David Lammy, and that probably has to do with some of the positions that the government has taken. And I think that there should be an awful lot of reflection going on across the political spectrum on some of the political posturing that's been going on around a conflict thousands of miles away, whilst this country completely ignores and fails to act against the rampant problem of Islamist extremism that has been running amok here in the UK.
Is it un-British, in the words of the Home Secretary, to protest against the situation in Gaza?
I think that if you're protesting about world events, you've got to be really careful about distinguishing that from what we've actually been seeing on our streets, where we've been seeing things that are extremely hateful. So, as an example, we've been seeing just last night and today, after the events in Manchester, after a terrorist attack on British soil, which has left Jews dead in pools of blood, we've seen people at these demonstrations calling to globalise the Intifada. I don't know what people think globalise the Intifada means, but an Intifada is a campaign of violence which sees dead Jews killed in terrorist attacks. And that kind of thing absolutely has no place on our streets. And we're seeing it now, even in this absolutely bizarre exchange that's going on between the Met Police online with a group called DOJ, which is a pro-Palestine group, where the Met Police have said, would you mind postponing your planned actions and demonstrations tomorrow? Because over the last several of their demonstrations, there have literally been hundreds of arrests. The Met has said, would you mind just postponing it so that we can have some of our police officers back to protect the Jewish community this weekend? And the demonstrators have said, no, we're just going to carry on doing what we do, and you'll have to arrest hundreds of us probably again. And the Met has said, okay, fine. I mean, that's not just un-British, it's just untenable. You cannot have a situation where the country's police forces, in the midst of the aftermath of a terrorist outrage, are tied up dealing with this kind of performative nonsense that ultimately is designed to take place, as tomorrow's demonstration is, in support of a terrorist organisation.
Let me read you the comments that have just dropped from Sir Keir Starmer, who's written an article in the Jewish Chronicle today. Peaceful protest is a cornerstone of our democracy, and there is justified concern about the suffering in Gaza. But a minority have used these protests as a pretext for stoking anti-Semitic tropes. I urge anyone thinking about protesting this weekend to recognise and respect the grief of British Jews. Can I also read you the comments of Zach Polanski, who himself is a Jewish man, the leader of the Green Party here, and I'm quoting him: conflating protests against the genocide in Gaza and weaponising that against an anti-Semitic attack on our streets, a terrorist attack, is deeply irresponsible. Democratic, non-violent protest is a cornerstone of our democracy.
Well, there's a lot to disentangle there, isn't there? Because what's really irresponsible is what Zach Polanski's doing. He's talking about weaponizing and things like that. The only weapon that has been used is a knife and a vehicle used to kill Jews at a synagogue. That's the weaponization that's been going on. And we're not talking about peaceful protests. When people are calling to globalize the Intifada, and they literally chant things like, from London to Gaza, we'll have an Intifada, and they attack police officers, and there are hundreds of arrests, and they get themselves, even in some cases, designated as terrorist organizations in this country so that the police can have adequate powers to bring them under control. That's not a cornerstone of British democracy. That is riot. That is glorification of terrorism. And that has created this boiling hot atmosphere in which people have started to feel that maybe Jews don't have a right to live and deserve to die. And there's something else about this as well, which is that these demonstrations are taking place not just week after week, as they did at the beginning of this war after October 7th, when Hamas invaded Israel and took all of those people hostage and murdered so many. But instead of week after week, it's now become day after day. This is something which is obsessional. It is rife with incitement. And unfortunately, I would also say the language that is being used is dehumanizing.
Just in terms of the language, and I take your point fully about some of the things that are attached to these protests. But in your statement today, you singled out the BBC. And in your statement, you said it's the bias and moral collapse of the broadcaster that has essentially turned them into spokespeople for Hamas. You can't seriously think that the BBC is a mouthpiece for Hamas.
Unfortunately, I do. And it's not just me. We do polling of the Jewish community, and over 92% now of British Jews feel that the BBC's coverage of matters of Jewish interest is unfavourable. But on the Hamas point specifically, that first of all, the BBC can't bring itself to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. Secondly, we've had the BBC actually sending money.
But we don't label certain groups. We've never done that. The policy goes back decades. It was the same with the IRA. It was the same with the Taliban. It's not specific to Hamas.
The thing is that you're happy to call Jihad al-Shami a terrorist, and the terror attack in Manchester yesterday.
It's not part of a group.
But Hamas is an organisation which is genocidal in its intention to kill all Jews. It says there in its charter that it wants.
I'm not saying we haven't got things wrong in the 2 years that we've covered this war. We certainly have, and some of it's been damaging, and some of it we've owned. But it's perfectly reasonable and appropriate for the BBC to report and investigate how Israel conducts the war and whether that response is proportionate.
But that's not what's going on here. With respect, we're talking about, if there is a murder, you will refer to the murderer as a murderer. If Hamas is a terrorist organization which deploys medieval methods of terrorism, then they should be described as a terrorist. And it's not just that. As you know, a BBC investigation has found that the BBC itself, and the BBC had to admit this, the BBC itself has sent money to the family of a Hamas official. The BBC broadcast...
Yeah, but I must also emphasise that there are constraints on the BBC.
When you have people on the stage at Glastonbury calling for death and...
Yeah. And I said there were mistakes and we've owned them and they have been damaging. But I must also point out there are constraints on the BBC. There is no access to Gaza. There is an inability... to speak to people in Gaza directly, and we are using second-hand sources. That is unprecedented. That is unprecedented to this war.
If you'll allow me to speak, the BBC is using Hamas spokespeople and parroting Hamas lines. There was someone on the BBC not so long ago talking about something like 14,000 babies were going to die within 48 hours if Israel didn't do this or that. And the BBC don't challenge it. It is a constant drumbeat. And when you have people talking about genocide, apartheid, baby killers, and saying that Zionism is racism and all of that kind of absolute vitriol, then it dehumanizes people who have any kind of association with Jews. It dehumanizes people who have any kind of association with Israel. And unfortunately, that is what the BBC has been guilty of. And I think the BBC needs to reflect, because British Jews have been saying, you are causing part of the problem. And if the BBC is so self-righteous that it will not listen, it is unfortunately completely complicit in the atmosphere of incitement that is happening against British Jews at the moment. And it's very sad to say it, because the BBC should be a national institution which has the respect of all communities. It does not have the respect of the Jewish community, and it hasn't for some time.
Gideon Falter, I know I must let you go. I am grateful for your thoughts this evening. Thank you for coming on.